This video is an overview of B11 hormonal system in the AQA GCSE specification. So if you may remember from B10, which is the nervous system, we did another overview video on that one, and you can see how homeostasis is actually maintained by the nervous system together with the hormonal system. So we've got, for example, the body is sensing a change, and then we'll use these two different systems to try to coordinate a response. So the hormonal system is different from the nervous system because it's slower. The effects might be slightly longer lasting. So there are loads of different things in there, but we're just going to focus a little bit more on the different hormones and different glands that release them and their functions. So in general speaking, we will first of all cover what are hormones, what are the 6 glands that can release hormones in our body, and also going into a little bit more detail about the menstrual cycle, which is a big chunk of the chapter, and then we'll develop a little bit more on that point. So we say hormones are actually chemicals. There can be different types of hormones. They can be made out of proteins or lipids, but generally speaking, they're chemicals that are released by glands. And glands are referring to the organs that can actually produce and release hormones. And we say that these hormones can then travel through the bloodstream and travel to another organ to cause an effect. So that's what hormones are. And we say that there are 6 major glands in the body. When we say 6, actually, really, we've got 5 in each person. And the reason why there are 6 in total because we've got the gender-specific ones, which is ovaries and testes, right? But we'll start from the beginning, the ones that everybody has. So you've got the pituitary gland, which is something we call the master gland. So it's in our brain. And the pituitary gland is called the master gland because it is able to release its own hormones, but also it can release hormones to affect other glands to release more hormones from there. So one of the major examples is how it interacts with the ovaries and cause ovaries to release hormones, and it can also interact with the thyroid gland as well. And actually it kind of relates to all of the other glands. But we say that it is the master gland because it can do that. The other 5 glands, they can release hormones, but they can't necessarily cause another gland to release further hormones, maybe with the exception of ovaries because of the very much interlinked relationship between these two. So that's the pituitary gland. We've got the pancreas as well, the testes, ovaries, thyroid gland, and adrenal gland. So these are the 6 glands, and you will need to be able to label them in a diagram. Now I'm going to just show you a little bit more about list out all of the hormones that these glands can actually release. So I'll start with the pituitary gland, and it's probably worth noticing that actually the pituitary gland can release loads of hormones, and we can't actually go through every single hormone that they make. But we're going to focus on a couple of the major ones, right? So for example, one thing that they can release will be growth hormones. So these are the hormones that would then travel through the bloodstream and get to our cells, for example, muscle cells, and then when they bind to the surface receptors of these cells, it will cause them to grow in cell size and maybe try to even divide. So this is what actually helps us become bigger. It helps us grow. Another thing that they would also make, something that you perhaps would go into a little bit more detail in B12, which is ADH, stands for antidiuretic hormone. And the antidiuretic hormone actually goes to the kidneys to affect the amount of water that the kidneys can reabsorb when they're trying to produce urine. So these are 2 examples of the pituitary gland. Like I said, the pituitary gland and the ovaries have a major kind of relation between them. And we'll go into this a little bit more detail later on, but just to kind of quickly illustrate. First of all, the pituitary gland can release a hormone called FSH, which stands for follicle-stimulating hormone, to the ovaries, and the ovaries contain the follicles, and then they can have an effect. Then because of the action of FSH on the ovaries will release something back there, which is called estrogen. And estrogen is probably one of the more commonly mentioned hormones in females, so you might have heard of it before. When estrogen will go through the bloodstream back to the pituitary gland, and they would stimulate the pituitary gland to release another hormone back to the ovaries called LH. And then the LH in the ovaries would cause an effect, and because of that effect, they would then release another hormone back to the pituitary gland, which is called progesterone. So these are the 4 hormones that actually are released by the pituitary gland and the ovaries, and they kind of go between each other to cause different things. And because of the existence of these 4 hormones and their interactions between these 2 glands, they coordinate the menstrual cycle, and also their levels in the bloodstream or in the body would change if there are changes in the menstrual cycle. For example, if someone becomes pregnant, so there'll be changes to it as well. And because of that knowledge, we can also use it to treat infertility, or even use that to as a contraception method. But we'll go into that in a little bit more detail later on. There's actually one more there, which I'm going to talk about, is how the pituitary gland can release a hormone called TSH. Not to mix this up with FSH, right? TSH would travel to the thyroid gland to cause an effect. So TSH actually stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. So when it gets to the thyroid gland, which is kind of around our chest area, thyroid gland specifically releases a hormone called thyroxine. And thyroxine is a hormone that increases our metabolic rate. So actually in some people who have a high thyroxine level, their body has a really high metabolic rate, meaning these people tend to get hungry very easily. They might even get tired easily because they just simply used up a lot of their glucose very quickly. And they tend to lose weight quite easily as well. Whereas people with low thyroxine levels would have a lower metabolic rate, so they would tend to gain weight a bit easier. And because of the difference of fluctuations in thyroxine levels, they could also lead to a gain or lack of appetite as well. So there are loads of effects there. We illustrate the relationship between the pituitary gland and thyroid gland because of their negative feedback relationship. So if there's more thyroxine being produced, they would feed back to the pituitary gland so that less TSH is released. Same with, kind of similar in the relationship between FSH and estrogen, and LH and progesterone. So far we've covered the pituitary gland, the ovaries briefly, and the thyroid gland as well. So there are 3 more other glands that we'll talk about now. The pancreas is probably a quite often mentioned organ. They can produce 2 hormones, which are called insulin and glucagon. And these 2 hormones have a major function in regulating our blood glucose level. So we say insulin would decrease or lower the blood glucose level. Right, so when usually our pancreas would release insulin after, let's say, we've had a meal or you've had a chocolate bar, and they would then have an effect on the cells to try to lower our blood glucose level. Whereas glucagon, on the other hand, would increase our blood glucose level. So, for example, if you haven't eaten in a long time and you're running low on blood sugar levels, then glucagon will be released by the pancreas to try to bring that back up. And usually this can be done by, let's say, converting some of your glycogen stores or your fat stores into sugars and then release it back to the bloodstream. And obviously, if the pancreas is not able to produce enough insulin or glucagon or regulate that easily, then that's what we call diabetes. Another gland would be the testes, which obviously only exist in males. And we say testes release a particular hormone called testosterone. And actually, you don't need to know more about testosterone in any more detail, but simply know that it triggers the secondary sexual characteristic in males and also produces sperm cells, which basically all interlinks together. Well, last but not least, we'll have the adrenal gland. And as the name implies, adrenal gland releases adrenaline. Now, adrenaline is a hormone which can trigger lots of different effects. So, for example, it can increase the heart rate, dilate our pupils, increase our blood flow to muscles, and etc. And the idea of that is because that it can induce what we call a fight or flight response. And we say adrenaline is usually released when we're facing danger, or you're doing something particularly exciting, for example, going on a roller coaster ride. And it would stimulate loads of different things on, for example, the heart, the eyes, the brains, etc., to prepare the body to fight against that dangerous thing or to run away from it. So that is what we call adrenaline. And interestingly, the adrenaline the adrenal gland is quite unique compared to the rest of rest of the glands and rest of the hormones is because adrenaline is not controlled by negative feedback. So in the textbook, you would very much kind of look at adrenaline and thyroxine as a comparison, because thyroxine is very much controlled by negative feedback, whereas adrenaline is not. And that's really important because, adrenaline is released when you are at a fight or flight situation, and if you've got too much adrenaline and it's controlled by negative feedback, that means the body will try to dampen it down, which means that when you're facing a dangerous situation, you won't actually be able to run away because of the negative feedback to dampen down the amount of adrenaline released. So that's the interesting thing about adrenaline. So that's the general overview about the 6 different glands and kind of what listing out all of the hormones that they make. What we're going to do now is to go into a little bit more detail about the menstrual cycle and also the different sorts of treatments that we can have around our knowledge on that. So we say that there are 4 hormones that are particularly involved in the control of the menstrual cycle, which is FSH, estrogen, LH, and progesterone, and usually in that particular order as well. So we're just going to have a very quick overview about what they actually do. So we say that in the beginning, the FSH is released by the pituitary gland, which is, and FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone. And the reason for that is because so this is the uterus, and we've got the ovaries at the end, and then the oviduct, then the uterus itself, and then the cervix, and then the vagina there. So we say that within the ovaries, we say that the ovaries contain the egg cells, which is the female gamete. But actually, to be a little bit more precise, the ovaries actually contain something called a follicle. So a follicle is simply a circular structure. So within the ovaries, we've got the follicles, and we say the egg cells are actually in the follicles inside the ovaries. So what we mean by that is actually we say males in general, they would start producing sperm cells because of the production of testosterone by the testes when they hit puberty. However, actually females are all born with a set number of eggs. So it's not as if females would suddenly start producing eggs when they hit puberty, but the eggs will start maturing at puberty. So we say that these follicles that are found inside the ovaries each follicle would contain one single ovum, one single egg cell. And when FSH is released by the pituitary gland, they would travel through the bloodstream to the ovaries to stimulate these egg cells to mature. And actually we say that in each month, in each cycle, only one single egg cell is matured. And in some odd occasions, you will have 2, which if that person gets pregnant during that time, it will lead to non-identical twins. But usually one single ovum, one single egg cell is matured at every point. So we say the follicle stimulating hormone would cause the immature egg cell inside a follicle to mature. And it's probably worth noting is that that's usually day 1 of the menstrual cycle, which is also at the same time as the FSH is released to do this, the uterus lining, which is usually on the walls of the uterus, will start to come out, right? And that is the period, that is the menstruation. So day 1 menstruation occurs, and FSH is released to stimulate eggs to mature. The FSH being released in the ovaries will cause the ovaries to also release estrogen. Now the estrogen has a very simple effect, which is to grow the uterus lining. So previously we've got 5 days, usually roughly, where the menstruation occurs. So this is, let's say at day 5, the ovaries release the estrogen to rebuild that uterus lining. So the concept of that is to prepare the woman to prepare for pregnancy. So we say the uterus lining would start to rebuild, and that's at day 5. So another effect of estrogen is that it can travel from the ovaries back to the pituitary gland through the bloodstream to inhibit further release of FSH, and that's actually quite important because one egg cell has also already been allowed to mature, and the estrogen is released to prepare for that egg cell to be fertilized. It doesn't want another egg cell to be matured and released at the same time to avoid complications. So actually estrogen will go back and inhibit FSH being released in the pituitary gland. As time carries on, the uterus lining is building since day 5, and about day 14, which is the middle point of the whole menstrual cycle, LH would be released. the estrogen in the ovaries would, apart from inhibiting FSH being released by the pituitary gland, it will also cause the LH to be released by the pituitary gland as well. So it goes back to stop FSH from being released, but to release LH instead. And LH has one simple function, which is to trigger ovulation. Now, ovulation is the process in which the egg cell is being released, the mature egg cell is being released. And at this point, what happens is that originally the follicle is like I said, it's quite a round spherical thing. But then imagine that now it's broken apart like that, and it releases the matured egg out of it. And it will travel through the oviduct. So like this, it's coming out there, and it will travel through the oviduct over the next couple of days. But at the same time, inside the follicle, apart from having the matured egg, it also actually has another hormone that has been hidden inside the follicle, and now it's also being released. And that is progesterone. So that's why the ovulation itself actually leads to progesterone being released. And then progesterone, on the other hand, would inhibit further release of LH in the pituitary gland. Again, same concept is you've already got one matured egg being released, you don't want to have another egg being released at the same time. And that's the progesterone has a straightforward function, which is to maintain the uterus lining. And the purpose of that is to prepare for the fertilized egg to be embedded within it in order to allow it to develop into a fetus. By day 28, the unfertilized egg would still embed into the uterus lining, but then it will trigger back to the original point at day 1 when menstruation occurs. Another thing about progesterone is that it can also inhibit, any release of FSH at that point, because again, same thing as you're preparing for one matured egg cell to get fertilized, you don't want another egg to be matured as well. So it kind of just stops any further release of eggs. But like I said, if the egg doesn't get fertilized, then we kind of revert back to the original point, and then FSH would be released again because of progesterone will also be released through the menstruation. So therefore FSH would then again be allowed to be produced and released, and we kickstart the whole process again. So as a quick summary just on this part, because it is quite a complicated bit, in the beginning at day 1 of menstrual cycle, we've got menstruation occurring when the uterus lining is breaking down and being released. At the same time, the pituitary gland will release FSH, which travels through the bloodstream to the ovaries to cause the maturation of eggs inside the follicles. It will also, FSH will also cause the ovaries to release estrogen, which stimulates the uterus lining to start growing again at about day 5, but it will also go back to the pituitary gland through the bloodstream to inhibit further release of FSH to stop any further eggs to be matured. Estrogen will also, while they stop the FSH being released, they will also ask the pituitary gland to release LH instead, which can then travel through the bloodstream back to the ovaries to trigger ovulation, which is where the matured egg will be released by the follicles. And because the follicle within also contains progesterone, therefore ovulation itself will also cause the release of progesterone, which will inhibit further LH and FSH release by the pituitary gland to stop any other egg cells being matured and released during that period of time. And the other function is that it will maintain the uterus lining as the egg cell is traveling through the oviduct to prepare in any situation where it is fertilized during that time to conceive. If not, the egg cell would still embed itself in the uterus lining, which can then trigger a breakdown of the uterus lining wall, and the shedding begins again. And day 1, progesterone also breaks down to cause FSH to be released again. So that is the menstrual cycle. And because of our concept or our understanding on this, we can actually think about how do people might want to prevent themselves from getting babies or even treat their infertility problem. So we've got two sides of the stories. Now, for someone who wants to have children but are struggling to conceive, the problem usually lies in the fact that they may not be able to produce matured or release matured eggs, or the eggs cannot mature in the first place. So one type of fertility treatment is to take pills to stimulate the body to release FSH. So by doing that, you can cause the ovaries to mature the eggs, and sometimes, usually in conjunction with that, they might also have LH as well to trigger the ovulation. So that's one basic idea, is to increase the level of estrogen in your body to allow more egg cells to mature, so that would treat your infertility. The other treatment for infertility is IVF, which stands for in vitro fertilization. In vitro means inside a lab, inside a test tube or a petri dish. So the idea is that you collect the egg cells and sperm cells from the couple and then fertilize them in the lab using a petri dish, for example, and then allow them to develop into individual embryos. And then you would put the embryos, any successful ones, back into the mother's uterus and allow them to develop naturally. However, there's also a risk of complications. For example, there is a higher chance for them to have twins because you're putting multiple embryos within. But that's usually something that people need to consider when they go for IVF. So these two are the major treatments of infertility. On the other hand, you will get contraception, which is the complete opposite, where people don't want to have children and they will try to stop. They would try to use different methods to prevent themselves having kids. So there are loads of different methods, but the general four major types of contraception is as follows. So first of all, you got the barrier method, which is, simply put, stopping the sperm cells from getting into the uterus. So typically, for example, the use of condoms or any other devices that can stop the sperm cells from getting through or physical method to stop the sperm cells from getting through is the barrier method. You can have the chemical method as well, which is the idea about killing the sperms or stopping the sperm cells from getting to the uterus alive. So typically use of spermicide agents is a chemical method. You can have the hormonal method as well, which is the idea about controlling the hormone release, usually of the female, to stop them from releasing matured eggs. If we go back to this slightly, for people trying to do contraception is to stop FSH and LH being released to trigger that ovulation of matured eggs. So whereas estrogen and progesterone both inhibit the release of FSH and LH, therefore people take contraceptive pills that contain estrogen and progesterone, stopping the body from releasing the matured eggs. The last method is surgical. So as the name implies, you're simply going to sever any possibilities of, for example, egg cells and sperm from getting through. So usually this is about how you sever the oviduct or the sperm duct to stop any release of the egg cells and the sperm cells from the couple's body. So that is the second half of B11, where it's mostly focused on the menstrual cycle and the female sexual hormones and what we can do with them based on our knowledge of them to help treat different situations.